Good evening, I'm Aaron Dahmen. In just over a fortnight, Poland will elect a new president. On the record, this is a battle between the centrist Warsaw mayor and a right-wing historian with little political experience. But in reality, the vote is set to be a referendum on the country's pro-EU governing coalition and will send a signal beyond Poland's borders on whether Warsaw will continue its growing leadership within the European Union or revert back to a path of Euroscepticism. In a moment, we will break down what's at stake with Professors Aleks Szczerbiak and Wojciuk. But first, with only weeks to go until voters head to the polls, this is the state of the race.
Poland's presidential election on May 18th may represent a pivotal moment for the country's future in the EU, either consolidating its pro-European trajectory or reviving an earlier anti-EU stance under Conservative leadership. The race now seems destined for a June runoff between Warsaw Mayor Rafał Trzaskowski and Karol Nawrocki, a Conservative historian aligned with law and justice. Sławomir Mencen, who once captured headlines with a surprisingly strong campaign start, has lost steam and is now expected to finish third. Nawrocki is running on slogans long echoed by right-wing leaders across the continent.
My Poland is a Poland without legal immigrants, a Poland not of integration centres, but of deportation centres for those who threaten our security.
His platform mixes a call for greater military sovereignty with fierce opposition to EU influence and unwavering commitment to traditional values, trying to paint Trzaskowski as part of the liberal left and imitating Donald Trump's rallying against the old world order. On the other hand, Trzaskowski represents a centrist balancing act. He has reaffirmed his pro-European stance, promising deeper links with NATO and the EU, as well as higher defence spending. He is also making liberalising abortion laws and strengthening women's rights key priorities if elected.
I promise to fight just as hard as before for a woman's right to decide about her own life and health. If the Sejm lacks the courage, I will submit my own bill.
But Trzaskowski has been adjusting his tone on other social issues, attempting to reach Conservative voters by visibly distancing himself from LGBTQ+ advocacy, which has drawn sharp criticism from progressive circles. At the heart of this election is a paralysing cohabitation between outgoing President Andrzej Duda, a law and justice ally who cannot run again, and Prime Minister Donald Tusk. Duda has been using the negative power of the presidency to stall the coalition government's proposed reforms, a pattern that would likely continue under Nawrocki or change if Trzaskowski moves into the presidential palace. But the May vote is about more than Poland alone. Across Europe, the political centre appears to be shrinking, squeezed by rising polarisation, with far-right and nationalist conservatives already leading governments in Italy, Finland, Slovakia and Hungary, and gaining ground in countries like Germany, France and Austria. Debates over migration, national sovereignty and traditional values increasingly dominate political discourse, while European integration, once seen as inevitable, is now treated with greater suspicion. Poland's choice may not just determine its own course. It could signal whether Europe's democratic middle still holds and which side of the fence Warsaw will land.
And joining me now remotely is Aleks Szczerbiak, Professor of Politics at the University of Sussex. Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
And in the studio, Wojciuk, Associate Professor at the University of Warsaw. Thank you for your time.
Good evening.
Professor Szczerbiak, if I may start with you, can you spell out the impact of this election on Poland's role in Europe? Does one candidate, Rafał Trzaskowski, mean a big yes to Brussels and the other, Nawrocki, mean no?
Well, the Polish president doesn't make Polish foreign policy. The foreign policy is made by the government. So in one sense, things will continue as they are. But I think that it will have the result of this election will have a very important impact on the political dynamics. The political dynamics being that if Rafał Trzaskowski wins, this means that the biggest obstacle to the government implementing its legislative programme and being able to make progress in Parliament with legislation is removed, because the government lacks the 3/5 majority to overturn a presidential veto. If, however, Karol Nawrocki wins, then that will make it very, very difficult for the government during the remainder of its parliamentary term, which is set to run till autumn 2027, and could set off a dynamic that could possibly even lead to the collapse of the government, or possibly even lead to early elections, which would, of course, could mean a change of foreign policy.
Professor Wojciuk, we've seen Trzaskowski push the issue of security over and over again on this campaign trail. Yes, he's also campaigning on social issues like women's rights and abortion access, but above all, this idea of keeping Poland safe. In your view, is that the Donald Trump effect at play?
Well, I think that this is Vladimir Putin that is primarily responsible for this kind of narratives which dominate Polish campaign and the war in Ukraine. I think this is the most important issue, and the Polish president is the chief of the armed forces and has its role in security, his role in security issues. So I believe this is the one of the few topics on which you really campaign, and the president has some agency in those ideas, because usually a large part of the campaign is about issues about which president has very little to say, and the issue of security is one in which the person really has some responsibilities. You also mentioned women's rights and abortion, and I believe there is a relatively little discussion about that topic, which reflects a broader shift to the right of Rafał Trzaskowski. Of course, he doesn't deny that he will sign the act which would liberalize women's abortion rights, abortion law in Poland. But I think he's avoiding this topic, and he's relatively rarely discussing it, at least in this part of the campaign.
And we will explore that in just a moment. Professor Szczerbiak, Law and Justice has long been in Donald Trump's corner. How will it reconcile its anti-Russia approach but continue selling Trump to voters even as America strays from Europe?
Yes, so I think one of the things they're arguing is that in terms of Donald Trump, you need to separate rhetoric from reality, from the actual policies that he pursues. So they say don't pay too much attention to what he says. Some of this might simply be trying to attempt to shift the position in terms of getting negotiations moving. Look at what the outcome of the negotiations is. So that's the first thing that they're arguing. The other thing that they would argue is that, I mean, regardless of what you think about Donald Trump, and regardless what polls think about Donald Trump, most polls believe that America, the United States, is Poland's main and only credible security guarantor. And their argument is that the current government, which is led by people who've had very bad relations with Mr. Trump. I mean, Donald Tusk has implied in the past that Donald Trump is a Russian security service asset, are not going to be the people that can build a good relationship with the main security guarantor. And that's one of their arguments for why people should vote for Karol Nawrocki. They would say that, you know, regardless of what you think of Donald Trump, regardless of what you think of Law and Justice and Karol Nawrocki, you've got to have a head of state that can have good relations with Poland's most important and main security guarantor, and that is Donald Trump. And to vote for Karol Nawrocki is the only way to do that. So that's an important element of the pitch for their candidate.
I want to pick up on something you mentioned earlier. How much of this vote will ultimately be a referendum on the governing coalition, and could, as you pointed out, could the ongoing cohabitation between centrist and right-wing forces in the event of, say, a Nawrocki win lead to a coalition collapse?
Yes, so I mean, Rafał Trzaskowski is desperate for this not to be a referendum on the government, because for lots of different reasons, the government isn't very popular. Lots of people, for different reasons, thinks it hasn't implemented the policies that it pledged to introduce. I mean, Civic Platform had a program called 100 Specifics in 100 days that it would introduce in its first 100 days in office. I mean, it's well over 100 days now, and it's introduced, I don't know, 20 of those policies or something like that. And that includes socio-economic policies like raising the threshold for paying income tax, which it promised to do within 100 days, but also, as Professor Wojciuk has pointed out, policies on liberalising the abortion law. which again, it promised to introduce as a priority, but has not been able to do that, partly because it's not been able to agree among themselves about this, not just because Andrzej Duda, the president, would have vetoed it. So I think he's really keen to avoid this being a referendum on the government. The problem here is that the opposition has actually got to be able to channel that discontent. And this has been Karol Nawrocki's problem, which I think he's only just really starting to get to grips with and possibly changing the dynamic, which is while most voters are disappointed with the government and a lot of them would stay at home, not vote for Mr. Trzaskowski as a protest, they've also got to feel that the opposition is an effective channel for that. And that's been the challenge, I think, for Mr. Nawrocki in Law and Justice up until now, that it hasn't been able to channel that discontent. And I think that's really the big question. I mean, if this does turn into a referendum on the government and Karol Nawrocki is able to channel that discontent, then in spite of what the polls tell us at the moment, all of them tell us that Mr. Trzaskowski will win. Mr. Nawrocki would then become the favourite to win.
Let's take a wider lens now, and I want to show you both a map on the screen. There's been a real swing in the political winds across Europe if you take a look. There are a number of countries who have hard right governments or main opposition parties, nationalist governments, or, as I say, in opposition. Professor Wojciuk, how do you see that conservative trend we see on the map playing into the presidential campaign here in Poland?
It plays very strongly. Actually, we can see that there is very limited support for left-wing liberal platforms. We have 3 candidates who are on the left of Rafał Trzaskowski, and overall their support is about 10%, of course depending on the poll, which is very little. And Rafał Trzaskowski is much more conservative than he was 5 years ago. It shows you this switch. Also, I would like to mention that it is also a kind of durable feature of Polish society, which has always been quite conservative comparing to many European societies, Western European societies. Polish median voter is the one who votes for the Polish People's Party, which is the peasant party, and it's still very conservative. In the 8 years of Law and Justice in power, it was in opposition and it was against the assault on the rule of law. It's pro-European, but in terms of the role of religion, the role of genders in the society, it's very conservative. So I think Rafał Trzaskowski does a very classical campaign, going to the middle and trying to persuade the median voter. This is my first point. The second point is that you can see this government, which is not very popular as it was mentioned previously, which tries to do a lot of gestures towards the liberal conservative electorate of Konfederacja. You see the government trying to lower the burdens on small entrepreneurs, which is a very important issue for those who vote for Konfederacja and Sławomir Mencen. And from the beginning, you can see the government trying to implement policies which would make it easier for Trzaskowski either to win some of the voters who in the first round will support Sławomir Mencen, the third candidate which was mentioned in your feature, or to demobilize voters who vote for Konfederacja. So this is, I think, one of the crucial factors shaping this campaign.
And Professor Szczerbiak, I want to kind of dig into that because Nawrocki was well behind Trzaskowski in the polls. That's been shifting in recent weeks. Do we effectively have 2 right-wing candidates here in this election? And when it comes to the European role, do you think Polish voters even care about the country's role in NATO or the EU? Is that top of mind when they're going to the voting booth?
Yeah, we don't have two right-wing candidates because a lot of what Rafał Trzaskowski has been saying has, as Professor Wojciuk intimated, has been pivoting to where he thinks he needs to be in order to win the election. I mean, he was as mayor of Warsaw, he attended the gay rights parade, the equality parade every year. He introduced regulations for religious symbols. So in Poland, this generally means crosses to be displayed in public places, the sort of thing that goes down very well in Warsaw and in the large cities which tend to be kind of urban and liberal. But that's not where Polish elections are won. Polish elections are won in the medium and small towns, which are, as Professor Wojciuk said, still much more culturally conservative. And that's why he's been pivoting on issues like that. And also on things like immigration, on environmental policy. I mean, he was a great supporter of, the Green Deal. He's now been saying that, that the EU's gone too far with it. So I don't think we should take too much notice, or indeed on migration. A lot of things he's been saying there that you've talked about are because, he knows where voters are essentially. So there's a real difference, a real policy difference between these candidates. And Rafał Trzaskowski is trying to appear more conservative than he actually is, because he, as Professor Wojciuk says, he knows that's where the median voter is, but also to try and demobilize the other side's voters, to make them think that he's actually not such a threat as not such a cultural liberal as they might think he is. I mean, in terms of foreign affairs, I mean, I think that Polish attitudes towards the European Union are actually quite mixed. I mean, I think Poles appear to be very, very enthusiastic about EU membership, but actually they are quite cautious about deeper integration. They're very opposed to Polish membership of the Eurozone, for example. And Law and Justice is trying to push against increasing EU competencies on defence policy, for example. And also, they're very, very instrumental. I mean, now they support EU integration because they think Poland is going to do well out of it financially. If they didn't, if that was to change, you could actually see attitudes changing very, very quickly. In terms of NATO, I mean, Poles are very pro-NATO. I think in this election, foreign affairs have played out more than they have in other elections, and that's precisely because of the international situation, because of the war in Ukraine, and because of the uncertainty created by Donald Trump appearing to question the United States commitment to supporting European security. So I think international issues are very important. They tend to ebb and flow depending on the news cycle, and if, for example, if in the run up to the election we were to get very, very close to a peace settlement in Ukraine, they could suddenly move right to the top of the agenda. So they are very significant, but the candidates don't really control their significance because it's very dependent on what's happening internationally and how that plays out in the news agenda.
When it comes to Rafał Trzaskowski's shift to the right, I want to play this clip again to both of you from a recent election debate, this one in Koński, a town south of Warsaw known as the place where elections are won. Let's take a look at this. I'll describe what's happening as we go. You can see Karol Nawrocki walks over to Rafał Trzaskowski and he effectively says something to the effect of, lately he's been distancing himself from this symbolism, pointing to the pride flag. Trzaskowski puts it away under his podium. And here you have a third player, Polish leftist politician Magdalena Biejat. Well, she makes a proposal to Trzaskowski and she takes the flag off him, says she's not ashamed of that flag. To me, this sums up where things are at. Nawrocki is targeting the LGBTQ issue by reminding everyone that, hey, Trzaskowski is the guy that walked in the pride parades. Trzaskowski is trying his best to pretend he never did. He's saying, look, this doesn't fit with my conservative profile building this election campaign. Professor Wojciuk, is Mr. Trzaskowski selling his soul to win the election?
I would disagree with Professor Szczerbiak, who pointed out that Trzaskowski's credibility is very limited on those issues. So perhaps on LGBT rights, that's true, but on migration, I would say that the shift which happened in the Civic platform and what Donald Tusk proposes himself, I think it is giving the liberals much more credibility on that issue, because in many ways Donald Tusk is as tough on migration, or even tougher than Law and Justice. He is constantly reminding about Law and Justice selling Polish visas to people from Africa and Asia, which is a very right-wing discourse. Donald Tusk is constantly reminding about that, and Rafał Trzaskowski does the same. So I believe that even though Professor Szczerbiak is right that the law support for the government is a problem for Rafał Trzaskowski, I think that on those issues which are decisive and which are from the right-wing menu, let's say, his credibility is quite high. On LGBT, I don't think this is the issue which is decisive. I just think he's trying not to focus on that, because it's a relatively small group of people for whom this is an essential topic, and that's why Magdalena Biejak was trying to distinguish herself from Trzaskowski to gain support in those groups, but her support is not huge, which shows you that generally this issue is not a decisive one.
So I want to put the same question to you then. Do we have two right-wing candidates in this election? Is Rafał Trzaskowski, can you still call him a centrist candidate?
So I would say he is a kind of classical right-wing, like there was Christian democracy in past decades, and the Civic platform is in Christian Democrat family of parties in Europe. And I think this is the mainstream right, and I think that the issue in Poland and in many countries in the world is that that there is more far right or extreme right, and that Law and Justice clearly moved to a much more far-right position than the one it had in the past. So I would say that both of them are right-wing, but one of them is moderately right-wing, like classical European Christian Democrat currently, and Karol Nawrocki is far-right, not extreme right, but far-right.
So you say we have two right-wing candidates. Professor Szczerbiak, you say we don't. Professor Szczerbiak, I want to put to you a comment from Prime Minister Donald Tusk from June 2024. He defiantly said after the EU elections, Poland is where Europe triumphs. Will these presidential elections be the real test to show if he's right?
Sorry, I'm not sure I understand what he meant by that quote. Is Poland is where Europe triumphs?
It was it was the comment. The comment was made in the context of Poland having a rather more liberal result compared to other member states of the EU.
Oh, I see. That's right. Yes. I mean, I think that, I think this is quite important because, as you correctly said, a lot of elections these days tends to be kind of, very similar sets of political and social forces that are coming up against each other. So you've got basically the parties of the kind of centrist establishment, if you like, which includes parties of the centre left and also parties that were classically Christian democratic centre-right parties, and their challenges these days tend to come from parties that highlight issues like migration, for example, and also, interestingly, tend to attract the support of a lot of the constituencies that have traditionally been left-wing constituencies. So the less well-off, the less well-educated people, living in rural areas, people in poorer professions. I mean, this is Law and Justice's social base, but also the social base of a lot of the kind of right-wing challenger parties, if you like, which some people call populists in other countries and in Western Europe. And in that sense, I think, people tend to view these elections in those terms. And in October 2023, Poland was seen as, as part of the vanguard, if you like. This was the country that was beating back the forces of the insurgent, what some people call populist right. And obviously, if it loses the election, if Rafał Trzaskowski loses the election, it'll be looking as if those political forces are now in retreat. And I think, that's what commentators tend to latch on to. They tend to kind of view these elections in the terms of these bigger trends, which in one sense they are, because as I said, you're talking about similar policies and similar social bases. But a lot of the time they tell you more about the the state of the election cycle, where people are. If they're incumbents, they find it difficult to hold on and to win. I mean, Law and Justice won because, a lot of people were just fed up with them after 8 years in office. They weren't particularly enthusiastic, I don't think, about, civic platform. I mean, they actually got fewer votes than Law and Justice, than the Law and Justice Party. So, but I think that's certainly how it will be interpreted. And I think it will send a clear message if Karol Nawrocki wins, that the civic platform government has definitely run out of steam. Okay, that political energy that seemed to be there in October 2023 has dissipated. It's gone. If he wins, of course. If Trzaskowski wins, it will be very, very different. And as I said right at the beginning, that could then set off a political dynamic which could have all kinds of consequences in terms of the government's cohesion, the government's stability, the government's survival, and indeed the survival of the parliament.
Much at stake. Aleks Szczerbiak, Professor of Politics at the University of Sussex, and Ania Wojciuk, Associate Professor at the University of Warsaw. Thank you both so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.